Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Fitz with explore.org. And in just a few minutes at the top of the hour, I will be hosting a special Fat Bear Tuesday and Fat Bear Week play-by-play broadcast. So please stand by, and I'll be with you in just a few minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Fitz with explore.org. And in just a moment, at the top of the hour, I'll start a live play-by-play style broadcast to describe the bear and salmon activity at Brooks River. So please stand by, and I'll be with you in just a moment. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special Fat Bear Tuesday and Fat Bear Week play-by-play broadcast. My name is Mike Fitz. I am a fellow with explore.org. I'm also a former park ranger at Katmai National Park. I'm not physically at Brooks River, so I'm viewing the streams online just like everybody else. But I'm going to do my best this afternoon to narrate the bear and salmon activity at Brooks River. I have the ability not only to look at Brooks Falls, but I can go downstream and we can see what's happening at the lower river. We can also check out and see what's happening underwater to see what the salmon are up to. So there will be several different cameras that I'll be switching in between, and I'll be identifying the bears, describing maybe what they're doing. Of course, we have a lot of hungry bears still utilizing the river right now. But I also want to give you an understanding of where Brooks River is, where Katmai National Park is, before we take a closer look at the brown bears. So Katmai National Park is located about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska. So Anchorage at the top right corner of the screen, Brooks River and Brooks Camp at the lower left corner. So it's about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska. And Brooks River itself is only about 1.5 miles long. It flows really from lower left to upper right between Lake Brooks, where it begins, and Naknek Lake, where it ends, on the upper right side of the screen. And Brooks Falls is about halfway in between. So we're going to be looking a lot at Brooks Falls today, and especially at the Falls Cam. So there are several different webcams at Brooks River. One live at Brooks Falls right now, another one at the mouth of the river, the lower river camera, and then that underwater camera that I mentioned before that'll give us a view of the salmon. Now, not all of the cameras at Brooks River are live right now, and that's due to just limited solar power at this time of the year. So that's the main issue. And one other thing that I want to mention before we start talking about the bears is I will be describing individual bears, talking about their life histories during this broadcast. And if you're not familiar with these individual bears, please go to Katmai National Park's website, and you can find the Bears of Brooks River, a guide to their identification, their lives, and habits. You can just type in Katmai ebook into a search engine. That might be the easiest way to find it. Or if you're watching on explore.org, you can scroll down below the live camera feed on any of the BearCam pages, and you can find a link under the More Information tab for the Katmai ebook. But let's see what's happening at Brooks Falls. So this is not, I guess, too surprising to see 5 bears fishing at Brooks River at this time of the year. Bears are going to start dispersing away from the river right now because salmon are becoming less accessible. It's after the peak of the spawning period for Brooks River. So we're going to start to see less or fewer and fewer bears over the next week or two. But it's not uncommon to see bears fishing at Brooks Falls at this time of the year. These bears are looking for fresher salmon than maybe what can be scavenged down at the mouth of Brooks River. So they're looking for some of the more energetic salmon to come up to the falls. Those salmon are still going to be looking for places to spawn, and they're going to be making mistakes as they get caught into the shallow water areas up here. So we'll keep an eye on these bears from time to time, and our wonderful camera operators from explore.org will also be giving us some different views of the falls area where we'll be able to maybe get some close-up views of some of the bears that we're seeing right now. I should, while we have a moment, introduce the scene down at the mouth of Brooks River, because there are going to be many bears in this vicinity moving around, scavenging for fish in the water. The area at the mouth of the river right now is actually the most productive place to fish. So you're catching a lot of dead and dying salmon in this area. And that's a stark contrast to what bears are catching up at Brooks Falls, where they're catching more live and vigorous salmon. So for a lot of these bears, it's a trade-off. They're making a decision saying, hey, I can go downriver, I can eat a lot of dead salmon, I just have to move around really slowly to find them, or I could kind of sit in place like these bears are doing and try to catch some more energetic and more calorie-rich fish. And that's what we're seeing these two bears in the far pool doing right now. The one that's standing and facing the camera right now, this is 151 Walker. So he's an adult male, I think around 11, 12 years old or so. He's grown significantly since I first encountered him as a young bear in 2007, but he's not a particularly large adult bear. So if we get a look at the bear that was fishing in the jacuzzi, we'll get to compare his size. And then on the far wall, a couple of other, it looks like young adult males that are fishing there. The one that's up in the corner looks like number 503. He's a bear with a very interesting life story. He was separated from his mother as a yearling and then was adopted by another female bear who's and she's using the river, so maybe she'll make an appearance this afternoon. And both of these bears that we see in the frame right now are really good at fishing in the far pool, and they're also apt to play with one another as well. We've been seeing a lot of bears playing in the river, and that's an indication that they are well fed. This is a season of hunger for them. They are going through a process called hyperphagia right now, which is basically excessive eating. It's a time of the year where their body shuts down. It says the body's capacity, I should say, to feel full shuts down. So that mechanism of fullness after a big meal is really turned off for them. So they're driven to eat and eat and eat. And this allows them to gain the weight that they need to survive winter hibernation. And this is a fairly large bear that we're looking at in the plunge pool below Brooks Falls right now. This is number 83. He's an adult male in his mid-teens right now. So he's really kind of at the peak of his size, and probably strength as well. And you may be wondering, well, Mike, how in the world, can you identify this bear? You're just looking at the back of his head. And, when you look at these bears long enough, their ear shapes become really important, their coat color. How they sit in particular locations, too, can give you some clues. But before the broadcast, I was also able to see this bear out of the water while he was eating a salmon. So I was able to look at his face. But each one of these bears is an individual. That's one of the themes that we see throughout a lot of these broadcasts, these play-by-play style broadcasts, is that we see them behaving in different ways, using the river in different ways. So not only are they different in their physical appearance, but also their behavior as well. And 83 is one of the bears that's large enough to occupy the jacuzzi. He's been fishing there for a number of years. He's skilled in that location, maybe not as skilled as number 480 Otis or 747, some of those other really large bears that like to fish in this location, but he's quite good at it. And I know our camera operators are still looking downstream for bears. It's a little bit of a breezy day down there, so maybe they've had their fill this morning and are out in the forest looking for a place to nap for just the moment. 83 being very patient, and that's one thing that we'll see probably throughout this broadcast, is bears being very, very patient, waiting for fish to come to them. They're so large that they don't necessarily get cold in the water. They're well adapted to cold conditions. So with their fur, their fat, and their overall mass too, they don't have a large amount of surface area compared to their volume. So they're just a big thing that tends to not cool down very quickly. So they can sit in the water all day and really not expend any extra energy in comparison to what they would do if they were sleeping on the land. So this is where their dinner table is. They can sit in the water, they can wait. And what they're waiting for is for the salmon to show up. So these are salmon that have yet to spawn. So these fish down at the mouth of Brooks River are waiting for the right time to move upriver to spawn. Most of their brethren have moved upriver and have already spawned or are just starting to spawn. We are, of course, past the peak of spawning activity in Brooks River. But these fish are just staging. They're just waiting for the right period of time. And this is not uncommon for salmon in Brooks River. It's kind of a unique thing where salmon will move into the river in early summer And then they won't spawn in the river until later in the year when the water temperature starts to drop. And that probably has something to do with the incubation period for their eggs. The water temperature really is a very important factor that dictates incubation period for their eggs. So if they wait for the water temperature to drop just a little bit, that might help those eggs incubate for the right period of time and hatch at the right time in the spring. We're also seeing a couple of different salmon species on the underwater camera right now. Most of these fish are silver salmon, also called coho salmon. And you can tell that they're coho salmon by the greenish backs that they have and the pinkish sides. They also have spots. So if we get one that swims right up in front of the camera, you might be able to pick out some of the spots that it has. If you look in the background, every once in a while you'll see a fish with a green head and a red body, and that's a sockeye salmon. So that's a different species, a little bit smaller than the coho salmon, but the sockeye are the most abundant salmon in the Brooks River watershed. So they're definitely the fish that arrive here first, and they're the majority of the fish that are spawning. These fish are really incredible animals, extremely hardy and tough. They show tremendous endurance to be able to stay in fresh water for weeks at a time, really without eating. Once they re-enter fresh water and begin migrating upstream, they do not eat. So that's one of the remarkable things about these fish, is that they're surviving solely on their energy reserves. And I think we'll try to return to them from time to time, just to peek in, because I love getting this aquarium style view of the fish in Brooks River. And these are wild fish. This is not an actual aquarium view. So if you're just tuning in, you're wondering what the heck are we looking at? We're looking at wild fish in Brooks River. And back up at Brooks Falls again, bears looking patient, acting patient, staying patient. We'll see some bears that are in the far pool over there, and that's a spot, against that far wall where they can really wait for salmon to swim right underneath their noses. The water's fairly shallow there, so it's harder for the salmon to actually find escape routes if they catch sight of a predator nearby. And as we look downriver, you can see that if a salmon was moving into that area, there would be a lot of escape routes. So that's a much tougher place to fish in comparison to at Brooks Falls, where the bears can really just wait. The salmon get disoriented when they're swimming through these these ripply areas of shallow water. It's harder for them to push through that area without as much water to fan with their tails as they're moving through. So again, being patient, knowing where prey is vulnerable is one of the more important things to learn if you are a brown bear, and the bears are demonstrating that right now. It looks like we might have a little bit of a play interaction going on here too. You see the one in the back swing. He just swung his head just back and forth a little bit, and that's often a sign. Hey, I'm ready to play, and he wants to see if the other bear is willing and able. So it looks like bear number 503 is the bear on the right. The one that he's wrestling with, that kind of has his back towards us, might be number 602. I am not sure of that identification though. But this looks like it could be a good old-fashioned wrestling match. You can see them just leaning on one another. The movements in play fights are definitely more gentle than actual fights, but they do resemble actual fights and sort of like the movements. So the cuffing that they'll do with their paws, the biting of the neck and facial area, that is something that bears do when they're actually fighting. So this is just a mimic of something that they may have to partake in when they're competing for other food resources in the future. But even though these bears are in that hyperphagic mode, they're experiencing some pretty profound hunger right now. That doesn't mean they can't participate in other activities. And I think this is a really good indication of that. Just a really great play fight going on between these two young bears. 503, the bear on the left right now, is a borderline young adult. He's approaching his sixth birthday, so bears are born in the middle of the winter. They'll be so all you can celebrate every bear's birthday basically around the end of January, early February. So he's almost 6 years old right now. Number 602, I believe, is maybe just a year or two older at most. So maybe just a year older, if that is the right idea for 503's sparring partner here. Up until around that 5.5 year of age, bears are, if they're independent of their mother, they're considered sub-adult bears. So they're not fully mature, but they're independent. They're still able to survive on their own. But they're not fully mature bears. But both of these bears look old enough, and they're behaving in a manner, over the course of this summer at least, that suggests that they are adults. And 503, especially for a bear of his age, he is really, really big. And I've said that many, many times throughout the broadcast that I've hosted this summer. But he is quite a large bear. For his age. So I'm really anxious to see how he matures and whether or not he's able to kind of carry his tolerance and playfulness for other bears into the future. Because the frequency of play actually decreases considerably as bears age. Now this interaction here between 151 on the left and perhaps an unidentified, looks like adult male there below him, was not necessarily a friendly interaction. You could see that both of them had their ears back. They were doing a lot of yawning. There might have been some growling there as well. I'm not sure if the Brooks Falls microphone is live for me during this broadcast, but bears, when they're acting defensive around one another or they're competing over a fishing spot and it's not a friendly encounter, they will often growl at one another. So play fights, in contrast, are very quiet. There's a lot of times heavy breathing because they're tired. It's a lot of hard work sometimes to play fight, but there's not growling or those defensive vocalizations that you would hear when two bears are competing for the same fishing spot. And we're getting a pretty good look at this bear on the far wall right now. This is a bear that I don't recognize, and that doesn't mean it doesn't have an identification number. It certainly could. It's just a bear that I don't recognize off the top of my head. Katmai National Park supports over 2,000 brown bears. Last estimate was about 2,200 brown bears, give or take a couple hundred on either end of that. And every year there are bears that show up at Brooks River that we haven't seen before, and sometimes fully mature adults that look like they've been around the block a few times. This bear doesn't appear large enough to be a really older adult, in the prime of his life. So this bear looks like he's still kind of on the younger end of the adult spectrum. But it's always neat to see new bears arrive at Brooks River because it gives us an opportunity to understand how they learn to maybe fish in a new location, how they are adapted to interact with bears that are very familiar with one another. Because many of these bears, like 503, 151, 83 that we had talked about earlier in the broadcast, see each other almost on a daily basis throughout much of the summer, at least while they're fishing at Brooks Falls. But you would get a new bear coming down to the river. That bear may not know any of these other bears. So it has to test itself and the other bears to see exactly where it's going to fit in as far as the hierarchy at Brooks River. So you'll see a lot of different types of interactions when a new bear arrives. Maybe a dominant bear sees a new bear and decides, hey, I'm going to tell this other bear who's boss. So I'm going to go over and challenge him. Or maybe the new bear decides, hey, I'm feeling big enough, strong enough, and confident enough to challenge some of these other bears that I see catching fish. Or I might even try to steal a fish from these other bears. So you can see really a wide spectrum of behaviors when a new bear happens to arrive. And most of these bears here, again, are very familiar with one another. They're going to be using Brooks River for, maybe for the rest of the month. They may start to disperse away. Brooks Falls gets the bulk of the attention, and that's really where most of our bears that we can see on the cams are located at right now. But down at the mouth of the river, again, to revisit this while our camera operators are looking for bears down here, this is a very productive place to scavenge fish at this time of the year. You can see how the river meanders back and forth, and that collects salmon carcasses. So all those eddies and side channels, and I think we just caught a glimpse of a sleeping bear. It was just below the frame there. So you might be able to see, if we go back to that frame earlier, you might be able to see there was a bear sleeping on the bank in the grass. Let me see, I'm going to try to type a message to our camera operators and see if they can take a look at that. So we'll see if our camera operators can give us a view of those bears. But getting back to what I was mentioning before, all these eddies and side channels, slow-moving areas of the lower Brooks River provide very productive places for bears to scavenge fish. And this is a really remarkable habitat for brown bears at this time of the year. And you can see there's a bear sleeping half in the water, half out of the water. It just looks like kind of a brown blob. Almost in the center of the screen, right on the edge of the grass. Based on his color, his location, the overall behavior or lack thereof for this bear, I'd say it's probably 480 Otis that happens to be sleeping there. This is a good indication or an example, I should say, of a bear who is comfortable in his environment. So in the water, even though that water is cold, that water's definitely got to be, below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's probably not very warm right now, but he's a big animal. Again, doesn't tend to cool down very quickly, has a lot of fat to insulate him. And if you're a bear, why work any harder than you have to? If you can sleep in the water, you're comfortable with that, then you might as well do it, because this bear can wake up at any moment and just move a few feet and start eating. So again, from an efficiency standpoint, a lot of these older bears are very experienced, and they do a great job of utilizing sort of the tricks of the trade. And this is just one example of that. Bears down at the mouth of the river, like I mentioned before, are going to be looking for spawned out fish that are not, and I'll transition to a still photo here just for a moment, fish that are not, that as rich in energy as fresher fish that have just arrived or are still spawning. So bears they do want to eat salmon that have not yet spawned, because those fish offer more calories overall. And that's why we'll see a lot of bears up at Brooks Falls, sitting in the jacuzzi, for instance, or in the far pool, trying to catch these fresher individuals. A sockeye salmon fresh from the ocean can offer about, about 4,500 calories. But when it spawns, after that, it's probably only about half as rich in calories. So it really does pay, if you're a bear, to try to catch the fresher fish if you can make it energetically worthwhile. So that's why we're seeing the bears taking time up at Brooks Falls to wait for salmon to come to them. And of course, we're seeing this alternate strategy down at the river mouth, where a bear is resting basically almost in the exact same place that he can find food. A little bit of splashing going uh, on the left side of the screen there. I think that was there's a bear hiding behind one of the birches, maybe just trying to catch a salmon. Sometimes we'll, even at this time of the year, we'll see some bears chasing fish. It doesn't happen that often because we see them, accessing a lot of dead and dying salmon downstream or fresher fish up at Brooks Falls. But every once in a while, we'll still see that. So in the background there, number 151 giving a little bit of a lunge, it looked like. 83, almost like he hasn't moved it since the beginning of the broadcast. Sitting there, being efficient. Again, that's a hallmark of a survivalist at Katmai National Park. When you need to eat a year's worth of food in 6 months or less, you got to do it efficiently. You can't, be expending excessive amounts of energy because you may need that energy to survive winter hibernation. And for these adult males, all the bears that we see in the frame right now, 503 in the far pool, 151 near the rocks, and then 83 who's sitting in the jacuzzi. Each one of these bears needs their fat to survive winter hibernation, but they also need that fat next spring to compete for mating opportunities. We often focus on fat as just like something that's important to the bears in the in the winter months, but they need it in the springtime just as much. Because when they come out of the dens, they're coming out into a largely frozen landscape where there's not a lot of food available, sometimes no food available for many weeks. So they're going to be surviving on their body fat during that period of time, really kind of waiting for the salmon to come to them. And before the salmon arrive here at Brooks River, the bear's mating season begins. So if you're an adult male like these two right here, and you want to have the opportunity to mate with females, you can't be wasting your time necessarily, roaming the landscape looking for food. You have to follow those females until they are tolerant of your advances. And those fat reserves that these bears are gaining right now are going to be able to give them that opportunity. And it looks like 480 woke up from his nap. He has a fairly characteristic face. He has a floppy left ear. His ears are really wide set, which is typical of mature adult males. Their skulls actually continue to get wider as bears grow and mature. So a 20-year-old bear is going to have a wider skull than a 10-year-old bear. So it's almost like their ears sort of like slide to the sides of their head over that period of time. And he's doing a fishing technique that we have nicknamed snorkeling, where he's sticking his face in the water and looking for anything that just can't swim away from him. We'll see where he goes. If he may move upriver and out of our line of sight, but I think our camera operator is going to try to follow him for just a little bit to see if we can catch a sight of him grabbing a salmon. Now he's looking under the water when he's moving around, but he's also feeling with his paws as well. For a bear his size and of his age, it's probably a lot easier for him to move into the water, or move through the water, I should say, just because the water helps to support, all that weight that he has. And he did catch a fish. You can see just how easy that was for him. I mean, he was sleeping on the bank for I don't know how long. Woke up, moved around for a few feet, and then began to eat. So again, a remarkable example of just how efficient bears can be. And it looks like back up at Brooks Falls, number 83's patience has paid off for him. So he's able to catch a fish. And I didn't see the beginning of his catch, so I'm not sure if he was able to catch a silver salmon or a sockeye salmon, or determine just how relatively fresh it was. A lot of the spawned out fish have very pale colored flesh. So with sockeye salmon in particular, that nice pink fillet that they, or the color to their flesh that we see in a fillet of sockeye salmon, those pigments are transferred out to the skin, and that gives them their spawning colors. So if you're watching the bear cams and you're wondering just how fresh is that fish that the bear is eating, if you can take a look at the flesh, that'll give you some indication of it. If it's very, very pale in color, then that's a fish that likely has already spawned. '83 leaving a few scraps behind. You can see that's quickly being cleaned up by the gulls that are in the vicinity. Bears not only find salmon important food resources, but salmon are important food resources to basically everything that can digest salmon flesh and salmon parts. Salmon really are the keystones of Katmai's ecosystem. So you'll see bears a lot of times almost being followed by scavenging birds, magpies, ravens, gulls, like you see one next to 480 Otis. Those scavenging birds don't necessarily have the ability to catch salmon on their own. They'll be able to pick at salmon that wash up on shore, but they are in many cases reliant on bears to leave parts of or uneaten parts of the fish, so they can make a living as well. So all of these animals are really living in a season of fat. They're getting fat right now to survive a harder period of time in the winter, and that includes, of course, many of the birds that we see on the cameras. So we'll try to keep tabs on 480, see where he goes. We'll look up at Brooks Falls again, but it's about halfway through this broadcast, so I would like to reintroduce myself. If you're just tuning in, my name is Mike Fitz, and I work with the bear cams on explore.org. I'm also a former park ranger at Katmai National Park, and I'd like to thank explore.org and Katmai for giving me the opportunity to share my knowledge and expertise with everybody this summer. It's been a really great year to watch brown bears fishing for salmon. This is a play-by-play, so I won't be answering questions directly that you may be wondering, but hopefully I'll be answering a lot of the basic questions about bear behavior and biology that you may have floating around in your mind. So we're watching right now number 480 Otis, perhaps the oldest adult male that we know of at Brooks River, at least 22 years of age. And it looks like he's scavenged maybe fish number 2. So he was napping at the beginning of the broadcast. He woke up maybe about 5 minutes ago, found a fish, and now he's on his second fish in certainly less than 10 minutes. And even though that salmon might be spawned out and not as rich in calories as a fresh fish, again, just 2 fish in 10 minutes, that could be 3,000 calories for him. So a good take, a good profit for him. And again, these bears are looking for fresh salmon, like we see here on the underwater camera. This camera is mounted to the floating bridge at the mouth of Brooks River. So this is a live feed of sockeye salmon, and mostly silver salmon. Excuse me. So those fish on the underwater feed haven't yet spawned. Excuse me. And they're going to be moving up to Brooks Falls, or just downstream of there. And it looks like back up at Brooks Falls, a similar cast of characters that we have been looking at throughout much of the broadcast. 3 adult males, none of them particularly large bears, so each one of these bears could have still a lot of growing to do. But trying their patience in the far pool of Brooks Falls, you can see that the ones nearest the waterfall are in quite a bit of water, and there's been a lot of water flowing through Brooks River all summer. Really, it really hasn't gone down since the springtime. So a lot of precipitation in the springtime, a lot of precipitation throughout much of the summer. That's helped to keep the lake level in Lake Brooks high, and that's translated, of course, into a slightly higher amount of water through Brooks River. It's not an unprecedented amount, and certainly we've seen this amount of water in Brooks River before, but it sometimes can make those fishing spots in the far pool just a little bit harder for the bears, because more water equals more escape routes for salmon. So the water is actually probably, the greater amount of water is actually probably good for the salmon that are trying to navigate Brooks Falls. Oh, and you can see, yeah, number 151 there just caught, looks like a silver salmon there, green back and pink sides. And he's maybe using that exposed rock just as a bit of a tabletop. A silver salmon weighs anywhere from 8 to 12 pounds on average, and sometimes much larger than that. So that if this is a fish that has not yet spawned, still fairly energetic, it could easily be this offer 151 several thousand calories, many thousands of calories actually, because a sockeye salmon is only about 4 to 7 pounds, 4 to 8 pounds on average, with about 4,500 calories. So you add, again, proportionally the amount of calories that can be found in a silver salmon. That's a big take for 151. So even though he hasn't been, catching a lot, at least during this broadcast, he only needs a few of those per day to really be making a good living. You can see how quickly he's eating this fish. That's an indication that his stomach is not necessarily full right now. On really good days, when bears are catching a lot of fish, and there are so many fish that they can't eat them all, they will do a behavior called high grading. It's really like they're a miner or a prospector looking for the high grade ore. And for them, their currency is calories. And if you want to maximize profit, you got to look for fat and eat the fattiest parts of the fish. And for salmon, that's fat is concentrated quite highly in the skin, the brain, and the eggs. So when bears are really well fed, they often will ignore the flesh and just strip the skin off, eat the brains, and eat the eggs. It looks like 151 though has not caught enough fish today to high grade them since he ate that whole thing. It doesn't look like there are many leftovers that are going to be available for other bears or scavenging birds. Back down at the mouth of Brooks River, number 480 Otis just finished his second fish, probably in about 20 minutes. He ate that very slowly, which is not uncommon at this time of the year, especially if you have a full stomach. I'm sure a lot of us can relate. When we try to have that second dessert or whatever, partway through we realize, hey, this is kind of a lot of food. But the bears again, they're feeling that hyperphagia right now. Their body has shut off that ability to feel full, and that's why he is out there after his nap eating fish, and this is his third fish in just a few minutes here. So again, making a living very easily just within a few square yards. I don't think he's moved really 10 yards in either direction from when we first spotted him during the beginning of towards the beginning of the broadcast. But he's able to pick up at least 3 fish during that time. And again, I'm going to transition back up to Brooks Falls. Another bear, perhaps number 602, is eating what appears to be a sockeye salmon. You can see the pink sides on that. You can also see the flesh. Look how pale a lot of that flesh is. So that's an indication that this was a fish that has already spawned. Bears will move throughout the river corridor looking for these dead and dying salmon. And the salmon get flushed downstream. They collect a lot in downstream areas, but that doesn't mean bears can't scavenge fish in other areas. It really just means that the more productive places to scavenge fish happen to be near the mouth, where we were looking at 480 Otis just a little bit ago. You can see the scavenging birds hanging around him, gulls. There was a magpie that was just in the frame. So they're looking for any of those leftovers. They're going to be eager to swoop in and pick up any scraps as soon as this bear gives them the opportunity. The birds can be quite bold. It's sometimes it's worth it for them to take risks, to be very close to the bears. And the bears, for the most part, just ignore the birds. They don't see them as competitors or sources of food. The birds are really quick. It's easy for birds to evade the bears. And the bears seem to know that. They seem to realize, hey, I'm just gonna, ignore these other things that are flapping around. Once in a while, however, we may see a bear that almost looks like it gets annoyed by a bird, and it'll swat at it or chase it. Or sometimes they're just being curious or playful, and the bear will chase a bird in a more playful manner. And on even more rare occasions, we might see a bird land on a bear. So you may have seen photographs of birds in Africa landing on an ox or something like that. Well, it's happened here at Brooks River. Just very, very rare, and the birds are just using it as a place to perch. It's not necessarily because they're looking for biting insects that are parasites on the bear. In fact, the bears in Katmai National Park probably don't have external parasites like ticks. People, we don't. When people are walking around at Brooks River, we don't encounter ticks. At least I never have. So I don't think that ticks are native to the Brooks River area. So they're largely free of external parasites. While that bear up at Brooks Falls finishes his catch, 480 Otis has caught another one. So if you're keeping score at home, that's number 4, probably in about 20-25 minutes or so. Probably each one of these fish, it's hard to say just how many calories it contains, but certainly probably around 2,000 or so. So 4 fish, 20 minutes times 2,000. Again, 8,000 calories for this bear. So able to make a living very, very easily at the mouth of Brooks River at this time of the year. And straight back to snorkeling. We don't really know why bears try to keep their ears above water most of the time. For whatever reason, they just don't seem to like to get their ears wet. Maybe they just don't like the feeling of water in their ears. But when they're snorkeling, yeah, they stick their eyes under the water, look and feel for fish. And there's another one for them. So number 5 for Otis in just a very short period of time. So probably coming up on 10,000 calories for him in less than a half hour. It's really kind of an amazing feat to see these bears eat so much food so quickly. Otis is a medium large adult male. He's not the biggest bear that we have at Brooks River, and since he's an older bear, he does suffer from some ailments like missing teeth, worn down teeth, and that affects his ability to chew and catch fish. But he's again, his experience, I think, is helping to extend his longevity, because he's certainly not hurting for any fat reserves right now. He definitely looks like he has gained certainly enough fat to survive winter hibernation, despite the fact that he's missing some teeth and also dealing with a lot of competition from younger bears, especially when he tries to go fish at Brooks Falls. And we'll check in with Otis again before the broadcast. We're taking a look downstream from Brooks Falls right now. So that's an area that we like to call the riffles. A couple of bears in that area right now. Looks like one bear is actually eating a fish. The other one may be looking to pick up some scraps. Scavenging certainly is a perfectly legitimate fishing technique for bears. So is stealing as well. From a human perspective, we say stealing is bad. Of course, don't do it. But bears, I like to say, live outside of our cultural norms, human definitions of what is right or wrong, what is ethical or moral. So sometimes you will see bears stealing fish from others, and that's something that they all do. Even littermates sometimes will steal fish from their brother or their sister. This is an area where bears, do have to be quite patient to catch any salmon that might be swimming by, because the salmon have so many different escape routes in this riffly area. Where these bears are standing, this is about 100 yards downstream of Brooks Falls, so it's not particularly far. But you can see that the bear, or the salmon, excuse me, have just so many places to go. So if they encounter a bear walking through the river, then they can easily just swim out of the way. But there are of course, a lot of rocks and dead and down logs in the water that happen to collect salmon. And it is too bad that we can't see into the water here, because there are probably dozens of spawning fish all around this bear. And they'll move away quite easily when the bear walks through. and then they usually return to their spawning site, their nesting sites, within a moment or so. I once stood on the platform near where these bears are fishing right now, and timed how long it took for the salmon to return after a bear moved through its nesting site. And almost all of the fish returned within a couple of minutes. Most of the time, much, much sooner than that. So the bears moving through the water do disturb the fish, but not to an excessive amount. Looking at this bear demonstrating that snorkeling technique, closer to Brooks Falls, just like Otis was doing at the mouth of Brooks River. A little bit of a lunge there, and it looks like that was a successful one. So maybe this bear was able to spot a slow-moving fish in the water. Looks like maybe a sockeye salmon that it ended up finding. And this is giving us a decent view of the flesh of that fish. And this definitely looks like a spawned out fish from what I can see. My video view of this bear eating is kind of small, so you may be looking at it on a larger screen than I am. So you may be able to pick out more details than I can. It looks like maybe that fish was only worth half a meal for bears. It's not uncommon for bears to leave scraps behind. Again, it depends on just how full they are. But that carcass will feed birds downstream, maybe other bears. It will also fertilize the ecosystem through the nutrients it releases as it decomposes. There also can be small fish in the river, like juvenile trout and salmon will also feed on salmon flesh. But really, they are, and the analogy I think that maybe describes it best is that they're kind of like French fries. And almost everything likes to eat them. So if you are an animal that can digest salmon, you're going to be trying to eat them at this time of the year because it is one of the few abundant and easily accessible food sources right now. This bear being a bit more active in its approach to fishing than we were seeing with 480 Otis. So he's covered 100 yards or so, just a short period of time, including one fish in between. Now that this bear has moved closer to the camera, I'm wondering it could be number 274, who is a young adult male. He was born in 2007, if this is the correct ID. He had kind of a light shoulder patch on him. You can see that shoulder patch. Fairly blonde, wide-set ears. Those are a couple of the characteristics that I look for when I'm identifying this bear. There are other bears that have sort of like those light shoulder patches. And I suspect that's sort of like a remnant of what is described as a natal collar that you see on cubs.